get weapons, more weapons into any area in the world, it's going to lead to more violence.
And that more violence can lead to victory and the end of war and therefore peace. No,
Okay.
I don't agree with your logic.
All right, okay, turning
One
back to
side
you, Mr.
winning ends the
Mackey,
war
London,
and
your take on what
leads to
our
peace.
guest has just said in Philadelphia.
Well, first of all, there's numerous points which we must take into consideration. The first of all, what is happening in Syria is very far from a civil war. A civil war has its own certain rules and forces and effects. Syria is a proxy war and not a civil war. What it is a struggle between the Syrian people and a Western-backed jihadi insurgency, which is very clear for the entire world to see. So when Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the United States discuss arming the rebels, they are essentially discussing arming al-Nusra Front, who are the biggest rebel forces, and the affiliates of Al-Qaeda. I fail to conceive of how William Hague could possibly give the so-called Al-Qaeda forces in Syria a piece of paper or a form with a few questions stating whether these weapons will go to giving democracy in Syria or whether these weapons will not go into the hands of extremists. It is completely inconceivable that any Western leader could possibly comprehend where these weapons will go when the majority of the forces on the ground are extremists. Another point, by essentially arming these extremist jihadist movements, you essentially create a Frankenstein monster similar to the type which was created in Afghanistan. What about the threats to European security or regional security, especially when there are up to 1,000 European jihadists in Syria? Imagine the techniques, the methods of fighting which they would have learned. This would essentially expound regional and global terrorism on a much wider scale. So what the United States are doing directly is attempting to destabilize and get rid of a progressive secular government and in its place have Sharia law wanting rebel forces, of which the majority of Al-Qaeda rebels, the majority of them are cannibals and individuals who have committed human rights violations on an indefensible and an incomprehensible scale. So the level of parity in the balances of power are not very different. Human rights organizations discuss the human rights violations within rebel ranks on a day-to-day basis.
Mr. Mackey, stay with me. I have to get in. A 12-year-old boy was shot in a... Okay, Mr. Mackey, I will get Mr. Pipe's response to what you've just said, but first I want to switch over to our Facebook viewers, and let's take a look at one of the first comments tonight.
So they sit on the table with America for Syria, but not for Palestine.
Okay, well, that's one of our comments. But before getting to your perspective of that, Mr. Pipes, what about what Mr. Mackey has just said? It seems that would be a lot easier for anyone to negotiate with a government than terrorists that are basically out of control and committing, even if you're saying both sides are committing abuses, wouldn't it be easier to deal with a centralized government than arm terrorists, as Mr. Mackey has just said?
The government of Syria is a brutal totalitarian government that is destroying its own people. One cannot apologize for it. It is cruel, it is vicious, and it is damaging its country. Now, I am not apologizing for the rebels. I think they're awful. I think the government's awful. Also, we have to bring into the equation here that the government of Syria is primarily supported by the Islamic Republic of Iran. And as you are well aware, there is great concern about Iranian growth of influence in the Middle East, and so stopping the Assad government from enhancing that Iranian influence is part of the reason to support the rebels. So there is no happy solution here. There are no positive elements. And to go on a diatribe against the rebels and talk about the democratic, modern, secular government of Syria, I think is a bit crazy. This is not a modern, democratic, secular government. This is a brutal, totalitarian government that's allied to the Islamist government in Tehran. It is secular.
You would have to admit it is secular.
Go ahead, Mr. Mackey. You want to comment?
It is not secular. It is not in the least secular.
The Syrian government is a secular government by nature, which is essentially had a concept of Arab nationalism. It is not extremist. However, he discusses the damage committed and the crimes, etc. What about the crimes committed in Libya or Iraq or other Arab countries? Who is the sole cause for sectarian violence in Iraq on a day-to-day basis? Was it not the Americans who came in? Who is the sole cause of the numerous, up to hundreds of thousands of deaths in Iraq? Directly because of NATO and US intervention in Iraq. So we could not argue that the same would succeed in Syria. What is essentially the main cause of sectarianism and inter-ethnic violence fueled in the Middle East is Western interference and intervention. So when Western countries want to arm the jihadist rebels in Syria, they're not doing this from a concept of logic or a concept of rationality. Essentially, these so-called the Islamic insurgents have no relation to Western democratic values whatsoever. In fact, the sheer notion of democracy and freedom in Syria, as Syrians perceive it, is very different to how Americans or British perceive it, as they have different cultures and traditions.
Okay.
What the American people feel that the Syrians want is American-style democracy. What the Syrians see in democracy is what the Americans achieved in Iraq, or what was achieved in Libya, essentially bandits and
all right, because I want to get on one other subject. Stay with me, Mr. Mackey. Daniel Pipes, I want to look at what John Kerry said as far as that Damascus had crossed the red line, according to U.S. President Obama, meaning that they have used chemical weapons. And we know that from the United Nations, they had said that there is no proof that the Syrian government has used chemical weapons. My question is then, how can Washington, based on something that has not been proven, actually send in more weapons, send more money, and continue to support the insurgents? According to Obama, it's crossed the red line.
Well, that United Nations report you mentioned is about 6 weeks old, and it was one individual. It was an interesting statement, but apparently U.S. and other governments have found convincing evidence in the meantime that the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad has used chemical weapons.
A new report just came out yesterday, Mr. Pipes. A new report from the UN just came out yesterday, and once again actually confirmed that there was no proof of of Damascus using chemical weapons against its own people.
I don't have the evidence in front of me, but the U.S. government has, in its wisdom, decided that chemical weapons have been used. I can't tell you if it's right or wrong. I can tell you, however, that the Assad government is very weak and is relying heavily on Iranian and Hezbollah support. It is not a secular government.
Which is why the Assad government is essentially regaining territory.
Excuse me, I didn't interrupt you. The Assad government is, in fact, doing well with Hezbollah and Iranian support. But to claim that it's in any way secular is completely fallacious. These are two Islamist forces, Sunni Islamist on the rebel side and Shiite Islamist on the government side, who are fighting each other. Okay. And I don't support either. And I hope that the fighting ends before long.
Mr. Mackey, go ahead.
This is the very sectarianist, Orientalist perspective which is so destructive and has essentially been a narrative fueled by the policies of Bush and the neoconservative policies which we see in Syria on a day-to-day basis. The UN report, which was released yesterday by the chief inspector in Syria, stated very clearly that there was no evidence of chemical weapons being used. If Western countries have this convincing evidence, then why do they not show it to the whole world so that everyone can see they have evidence? So far, European countries have shown no evidence whatsoever. The fact is, because they don't have evidence, it is just a statement which is used as pressure against the Assad government. The Assad government is a secular government, whether you like it or not. The fact that you state they're using Shia militants is not necessarily true, as 70% of the Syrian army is Sunni, as Syria is a Sunni majority state. The fact that you discuss Shia and Hezbollah is only after the intervention of 40,000 Arab foreign jihadists who've essentially come to essentially occupy Syria with Sharia law, as we have seen in the north of Syria at this current moment in time. So if you ask whether it's against a secular, progressive
all right, Mr. Mackey, I am so sorry to have to cut you off, but we are out of time. I appreciate both my guests being with me, co-founder of Syrian Youth in Britain, Mr. Danny Mackey, out of London, and the director of the Middle East Forum, Mr. Daniel Pipes, out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Appreciate both of you being with us, and appreciate you viewers for being with us right here at the debate. Make sure you join us right here, same time tomorrow. I'm Marzia Hashemi, signing out for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. Thanks so much, and goodbye.